The rain drizzled softly against the windows of the quiet hospital room, casting a somber mood over the air. Officer Ryan Carter lay motionless on the hospital bed. His face pale, his breathing slow. Machines beeped rhythmically, monitoring his vitals. A decorated K-9 officer, Ryan had spent years serving the community alongside his loyal German Shepherd Max. But now, after a tragic accident in the line of duty, he was fighting for his life. Max sat by the door, ears perked up. His sharp eyes locked onto the still figure of his partner. He had spent years by Ryan's side, chasing criminals, searching for missing people, and protecting his handler with his life. But now, for the first time, Ryan wasn't the strong, commanding presence Max had always known. He was weak, unmoving, and Max could feel that something wasn't right. The hospital had allowed Max to visit, understanding the deep bond between a police officer and his K-9 partner. Nurses whispered as they watched the dog sit solemnly, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Officer Ryan's colleagues stood in the hallway, some wiping away silent tears, others shaking their heads at the cruel twist of fate. Ryan's family was gathered around his bed. His wife, Emily, clutched his hand, whispering words of love and encouragement. His younger brother, Jake, stood at the foot of the bed, eyes filled with sorrow. Doctors had given them little hope. Ryan's injuries were severe, and his body was shutting down. Max whined softly and took a hesitant step forward. Emily noticed and turned toward the dog, her lips trembling as she gave a weak smile. "Come on, Max," she whispered, motioning him forward. "Say goodbye." The room fell silent as Max padded forward, his claws clicking softly against the hospital floor. He reached Ryan's bedside and gently placed his head on his handler's chest. For a moment nothing happened. Then, a soft sigh escaped Ryan's lips, as if he could feel his partner's presence. But then something changed. Max suddenly stiffened. His ears shot up, his nose twitched, and his body tensed. A low growl rumbled from deep in his throat. His eyes darted around the room, then locked onto the doctor standing near the monitors. Everyone froze. Max had spent years training to sense danger, to detect things humans couldn't. He had never reacted this way inside a hospital, never growled at a doctor before. But now something was different. The doctor, an older man in a white coat, shifted uncomfortably under the dog's intense gaze. "Easy, boy," he muttered, taking a small step back. But Max didn't relax. His growl deepened. His muscles coiled, ready to pounce. His sharp canine instincts screamed that something was wrong. Emily frowned and looked at the doctor. "Why is he growling at you?" she asked, her voice uncertain. The doctor forced a smile. "He's probably just stressed. Dogs react to hospitals in different ways." But Max's growl only grew louder. His eyes never left the doctor. And in that moment, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Something wasn't right. And Max knew it. Emily's heart pounded as she glanced between Max and the doctor. The room, once filled with quiet murmurs and the soft beeping of machines, now felt thick with tension. Max's growl wasn't just a warning. It was a message. A deep, instinctual reaction. He had spent years by Ryan's side, trained to detect danger, to sniff out hidden threats. And now, in this small hospital room, something had triggered him. The doctor, his expression calm but his fingers tightening around the clipboard, took another step back. "Dogs can be unpredictable in stressful situations," he said, forcing a chuckle. "It's understandable." He's sensing the emotions in the room. Emily wanted to believe that. She wanted to brush it off, to tell herself that Max was just confused, overwhelmed by the sterile smell of the hospital and the unfamiliar environment. But Max wasn't an ordinary dog. He wasn't the type to react without reason. Ryan's younger brother, Jake, narrowed his eyes. He had known Max for years. He had seen him in action, watched him track down criminals, alert Ryan to danger before anyone else noticed. "No," Jake muttered under his breath. "This isn't normal." Max's growl deepened. His body tense like a coiled spring. His gaze never wavered from the doctor. Then, without warning, he let out a sharp bark, loud and commanding. Emily jumped. The doctor flinched. The sound echoed down the hallway, making the officers outside turn their heads in alarm. One of the nurses poked her head into the room. "Is everything okay?" Emily nodded quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yeah. Max is just uneasy." The doctor took another step back, exhaling. "I should check his vitals again," he said, nodding toward Ryan. His voice was even professional, but there was something in his eyes, something guarded. Max let out another low growl. Jake, still watching closely, spoke up. "Hold on. I think we should wait." The doctor hesitated. "Wait for what?" Jake stepped forward slightly, his jaw tightening. "Just a second." He turned to Max, kneeling down in front of him. The dog's breathing was steady, his body alert. Jake had seen Max in action enough times to know this wasn't just hospital stress. Emily swallowed hard and turned to the doctor. "Why does he keep growling at you?" Her voice was careful, controlled. But her heart was racing. The doctor hesitated, then gave a short laugh. "I must remind him of someone he doesn't like." He looked at Max and took a step toward the bed. Max snapped his head up and barked again, sharper this time. His body tense as if ready to lunge. His ears pinned back, teeth bared just slightly, not in full aggression but in a clear warning. The doctor stopped in his tracks. Emily saw it then, the flicker of something in the doctor's eyes. Not fear, not surprise, but something else. Annoyance. Frustration. She looked at Ryan, still unconscious, still unaware of everything happening around him. If he were awake, he'd understand Max's reaction. He'd trust his partner without hesitation. But Ryan wasn't awake. And Emily didn't know what to do. A knock at the door made everyone turn. Another doctor, younger, with short dark hair and a calm expression, stepped inside. "Dr. Whitman," he said, looking at the older doctor. "I need to speak with you." The older doctor, Dr. Whitman, hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, walking past the other doctor without making eye contact. Max's growl faded the moment he was gone. Emily exhaled slowly, feeling her pulse thudding in her ears. She looked down at Max, who was still staring at the door, his body rigid. Jake exchanged a glance with her. That wasn't normal. Emily shook her head. No, it wasn't. The younger doctor turned to them. "I heard the barking from down the hall," he said. "Is everything okay?" Emily hesitated, unsure how much to say. She looked at Jake, then at Max. Jake took a deep breath. Max didn't like the other doctor. The younger doctor frowned. "Dr. Whitman." Jake nodded. "Yeah." Max wouldn't stop growling at him. The doctor pursed his lips, glancing at the still sleeping Ryan before looking back at them. He hesitated, then said quietly, "Dr. Whitman isn't Ryan's primary doctor. He was just here to check in. He wasn't supposed to be handling his case today." Emily's stomach tightened. Then why was he in here? The doctor hesitated again, then lowered his voice even more. "I don't know." The room fell into silence. Max finally sat down, his ears still alert, his gaze still fixed on the door. Emily's mind raced. She wanted to believe that this was all just some strange misunderstanding, that Max was simply reacting to stress. But something deep inside told her that wasn't true. Max had sensed something. And Emily had a terrible feeling that whatever it was, it wasn't over yet. The room felt colder now, as if Max's reaction had left an invisible weight in the air. Emily kept glancing toward the door, half expecting Dr. Whitman to return, but the hallway outside remained quiet. Max had finally stopped growling, but his body was still tense. His eyes locked on the door like he was waiting for something, or someone to come back. Jake crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Something feels off." Emily nodded slowly. Max doesn't react like that unless there's a reason. I don't know what it is, but I trust him. The younger doctor, who had introduced himself as Dr. Patel, glanced at Ryan's monitors, checking his vitals. His face remained neutral, but Emily noticed the way his jaw tightened slightly. Dr. Whitman isn't usually careless, he said after a pause. But if Max reacted like that, it's worth paying attention to. He hesitated, then added, Ryan's condition hasn't changed, but I'll keep an extra eye on him. Just in case. Emily appreciated the reassurance, but it did little to ease the feeling creeping up her spine. She reached down and gently ran her fingers through Max's fur. He was still on edge. Jake exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. What if Max smelled something? Maybe something was off with the medicine, or... He trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know. But I've seen that dog take down criminals before they even made a move. I don't think he was wrong about this. Emily swallowed hard. She knew Jake was right. She could see it in Max's eyes. Hours passed, but the unease never left. Ryan remained unconscious, his breathing steady but unchanged. Emily stayed by his side, holding his hand, whispering to him about their home, their life, their love. She wanted to believe he could hear her. Max never left the room. That night, as the hospital quieted down, Emily noticed something strange. A nurse had come in earlier to check Ryan's IV, adjusting the medication drip. Now, as she looked at it, she frowned. She had been paying attention to every little detail since Max's reaction, and something about the clear liquid in the IV bag didn't seem right. It looked different. Maybe it was just the dim lighting, or maybe she was overthinking everything after the long day. Still, her gut told her to be sure. She stood up and stepped into the hallway, searching for a nurse. It was late, and most of the staff had retreated to their stations or patient rounds. Finally, she spotted a nurse near the reception desk. "Excuse me," Emily said softly, trying to keep her voice calm. "I just wanted to ask. Ryan's medication in his IV. Has anything changed?" The nurse looked at her screen, scanning through the records. "No, it's the same dosage and prescription." She turned back to Emily with a reassuring smile. "Everything is as it should be." Emily nodded slowly, forcing a smile back. "Okay. Thank you." But something still didn't feel right. She turned to head back to the room when she caught a glimpse of movement further down the hallway. A figure in a white coat was walking toward the exit. Dr. Whitman. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know why, but seeing him again sent a fresh wave of unease through her. He wasn't on duty. Why was he still here this late? Then she noticed something else. He wasn't alone. Another man, dressed in dark clothing, walked beside him. Their conversation was hushed, their body language tense. Emily quickly ducked behind the corner, peering carefully. She had no reason to spy, no real evidence that anything was wrong. But something inside her told her to watch. The two men stopped near a supply closet. Dr. Whitman glanced around before stepping inside with the other man. The door clicked shut behind them. Emily's pulse quickened. She didn't know what she was expecting, but she suddenly wished Jake was with her. Taking a slow breath, she moved closer, staying quiet. She didn't dare get too close, but as she inched toward the door, she could faintly hear voices from inside. "Everything is in place," one of them said. "Not much time. If anyone notices." Pause. Then Dr. Whitman's voice, lower this time. "It's already done." Emily's stomach twisted. She had no idea what they were talking about, but she knew it wasn't good. A soft whine made her jump slightly, and she turned to see Max standing behind her. He had followed her into the hallway, silent as a shadow. His ears were perked, his eyes focused on the door. Emily placed a hand on his back, grounding herself. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what to do. But most of all, she needed to find out what was really going on. Emily's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She pressed her back against the cool hospital wall, barely daring to breathe as she listened. Max stood by her side, still and alert, his ears twitching at the muffled voices coming from inside the supply closet. She wanted to move, to run back to Ryan's room and pretend she hadn't heard anything. But she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening involved her husband. Max had known something was off. And now, standing here in this dimly lit hallway, Emily knew it too. Inside the closet, the voices continued in low, hurried tones. "She's been asking questions," one of the men said. "She won't be a problem," Dr. Whitman responded, his voice flat. "Everything's already in motion." Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine. Who were they talking about? Was it her? Max let out the faintest growl, barely more than a vibration in his throat, but Emily immediately reached down, gently running her fingers over his back to keep him calm. If they heard him, if they realized someone was listening. The door handle rattled. Emily's breath caught. She grabbed Max's collar and quickly stepped back, slipping around the corner just as the supply closet door opened. She didn't dare look, but she could hear footsteps moving down the hallway, the soft murmur of voices fading as Dr. Whitman and the other man walked away. Emily stayed frozen for a few seconds, waiting until she was sure they were gone. Then, carefully, she peeked around the corner. The hallway was empty. She exhaled shakily and turned to Max. "We need to get back to Ryan," she whispered. Max didn't hesitate. He moved quickly beside her as she hurried back to the hospital room. When she stepped inside, Jake was still by Ryan's bedside, his arms crossed. He looked up the second she entered. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately. Emily didn't know where to start. She shut the door behind her and turned to him, lowering her voice. "I just saw Dr. Whitman. He was talking to someone in the hallway, someone I didn't recognize. They were saying something was already done, and they sounded— I don't know, Jake. It sounded wrong." Jake frowned, standing up straight. "What do you mean, already done?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know, but I have a bad feeling." Jake looked at Max, who was still alert, his body stiff. That was all the confirmation he needed. "Okay," he said, voice firm. "Then we don't ignore this." He pulled out his phone and quickly started typing. "What are you doing?" Emily asked. "I'm texting one of Ryan's friends from the force," Jake muttered. "I don't like this. If something's off, we need backup." Emily felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. A moment later, the door to the room opened again. Dr. Whitman stepped inside. Emily stiffened. Max let out a quiet, warning growl. Dr. Whitman's face remained calm, unreadable. His eyes flickered toward Max, then back to Ryan. "I was just coming to check in on his condition," he said. His voice smooth, professional. "Has there been any change?" Emily glanced at Jake, who subtly shifted to block his phone screen from view. "No change," she said carefully. Dr. Whitman nodded, stepping toward the bed. He glanced at the monitors, his expression unreadable. Then he reached for the 4-line. Max suddenly lunged forward, barking sharply. Dr. Whitman jerked back in surprise, his eyes widening slightly. "Max, no," Emily said quickly, grabbing his collar. But she wasn't scolding him, she was watching Dr. Whitman. The doctor composed himself almost immediately, straightening his coat. "Your dog seems very protective," he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. Emily forced a tense smile. "He always is." Dr. Whitman studied her for a long moment. Then he turned back to Ryan, checking the 4 again. Emily watched closely, her heart hammering. She didn't know what she was expecting, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Max had just stopped something from happening. Finally, Dr. Whitman stepped back. "Well," he said, "I'll be making my rounds. Let me know if there's any change." Emily and Jake both stayed silent as he walked out of the room. The second he was gone, Emily turned to Jake. "Something's wrong." Jake nodded. "I know." Max sat by the door, ears alert, watching. The feeling in Emily's chest tightened. Something was happening, something dangerous, and they were running out of time to figure it out. Emily's hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. She turned to Jake, trying to steady her breathing. "We can't just sit here and wait," she whispered. "What if Max was right? What if something's actually wrong with Ryan's 4? Jake nodded, already moving toward the 4 stand. He wasn't a doctor, but he had seen enough during his years around Ryan to know what a standard saline drip looked like. He leaned in, inspecting the bag carefully. Emily watched as his expression darkened. "This isn't right," he muttered. Emily's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Jake looked around as if making sure no one else was near. Then he whispered, "There should be a label with the exact medication and dosage." "But look," he pointed at the bag. "The label is missing." Emily's breath caught. She hadn't noticed before, but now that Jake pointed it out, she realized he was right. Every other 4 bag in the hospital had a printed sticker with details about the medication inside. But this one had nothing. She swallowed hard. "Jake, what if they gave him something they weren't supposed to?" Jake's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone again. "I'm calling someone," he muttered. Before he could dial, the door swung open. A nurse stepped in, looking rushed. She barely glanced at Emily or Jake, going straight for the 4. "Excuse me," she said quickly. "I just need to replace this." Emily's entire body went rigid. Max suddenly stood up, his ears twitching, his gaze locked on the nurse. Jake stepped forward, blocking her path. "Wait a second," he said firmly. "Why are you replacing it?" His chart didn't say anything about a medication change. The nurse hesitated. It was just a fraction of a second, but Emily saw it, the slight flicker of unease in her eyes. She forced a smile. "It's just standard protocol," she said smoothly. "Routine check." Emily exchanged a glance with Jake. Neither of them believed her. Max let out a soft growl. The nurse's fingers twitched around the 4 line. "I need to do this," she said. "Step aside, please." Jake didn't move. "Not until we talk to his actual doctor." The nurse's smile faltered. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. She suddenly felt like she was standing on the edge of something huge. Something dangerous. The nurse took a breath, as if she was about to argue again. But before she could say another word, a voice came from the hallway. "What's going on here?" "Dr. Patel." He stepped inside, his eyes immediately locking onto the nurse. His expression remained neutral, but there was something sharp behind his gaze. The nurse quickly straightened. "I was just changing his 4, she said smoothly. Dr. Patel's face remained unreadable. Then he said, "Ryan's 4 doesn't need to be changed." Beat of silence. The nurse stiffened. "There must have been a mistake." "I'll handle it," Dr. Patel cut in. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. The nurse hesitated for just a moment longer, then slowly stepped back. "Of course," she said lightly. "I'll check with the pharmacy." Without another word, she turned and walked out. Emily barely breathed until she was gone. Dr. Patel let out a slow exhale. Then he turned to Jake and Emily. "Something isn't right," he said quietly. Jake nodded. "We know." Dr. Patel stepped toward Ryan's 4, examining it closely. His brows furrowed. Then he carefully disconnected the bag and held it up to the light. His expression darkened. "This isn't what he was prescribed," he muttered. Emily felt her knees go weak. Dr. Patel turned to them, his voice grave. If Max hadn't reacted, Ryan could have been in real danger. Emily's breath hitched. "Danger?" she whispered. "You mean?" Dr. Patel looked at her, hesitation flickering across his face. Then he said, "I need to test this to be sure." Jake's fists clenched. "We need to find out who's behind this. And fast." Emily's mind was spinning. First, Dr. Whitman. Then the suspicious conversation in the supply closet. Now a mysterious medication switch. Someone was trying to harm Ryan. And they were still in the hospital. Emily felt her whole body tense as Dr. Patel carefully placed the 4-bag on a nearby tray. The room was silent except for the steady beeping of Ryan's heart monitor. Max sat by the door, his ears alert, watching everything with sharp focus. Jake finally broke the silence. If that wasn't the right medication, then what was it? His voice was low, controlled, but Emily could hear the anger beneath it. Dr. Patel shook his head. I don't know yet, but I'll find out. He grabbed a pair of gloves and carefully took a small sample from the bag into a vial. I'll send this to the lab right away. Emily's hands curled into fists. Someone is trying to hurt Ryan, she whispered. Saying it out loud made it feel even more real, and the weight of it settled heavily on her chest. Jake exhaled sharply. It has to be Whitman, he muttered. That guy's been acting off since we got here. Dr. Patel hesitated. If Whitman is involved, we need proof. Emily looked toward the door, her heart racing. What if he knows we're on to him? As if on cue, footsteps echoed down the hallway. They were quick, purposeful. Emily turned just in time to see Dr. Whitman stepping into the room. His expression was calm, professional as always, but there was something unsettling in the way his eyes swept over them. I heard there was a problem, he said smoothly, glancing toward the 4-stand. His gaze lingered on the missing bag for just a second too long. Emily swallowed hard. Dr. Patel was just checking on Ryan, she said carefully. We noticed something strange with his 4. Dr. Whitman's face didn't change, but there was a flicker of something cold behind his eyes. Strange, he repeated, stepping closer to the bed. Max let out a low growl. Dr. Whitman stopped mid-step. His lips pressed into a thin line as he glanced down at the dog. That's quite the reaction. Emily placed a hand on Max's back, feeling the tension in his muscles. He knows when something's wrong, she said quietly. Dr. Whitman's gaze flicked to her, then to Dr. Patel. If you had concerns about the medication, you should have brought them directly to me, he said. I am the senior physician on duty. Dr. Patel didn't blink. I checked the 4-bag, he said evenly. It wasn't the prescribed medication. For the first time, Dr. Whitman's composure slipped. It was just a fraction of a second, a tightening around his eyes, a slight shift in his posture. But Emily saw it. Then, just as quickly, his expression smoothed out again. There must have been a mix-up, he said. Jake took a step forward. Is that what you're calling it? Dr. Whitman exhaled, shaking his head. This is unnecessary. I've been Ryan's doctor since he arrived. I only want what's best for my patients. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. He was lying. She knew it. And so did Max. In the next second, the dog suddenly lunged. He didn't attack, but he barked, loud and sharp. His body tensed as if ready to pounce. Dr. Whitman flinched. It was small, but it was enough. Jake caught it too. You're nervous, he said quietly. Why? Dr. Whitman opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a second set of footsteps approached the room. Dr. Whitman. They all turned as a uniformed officer stepped inside. Behind him was another man, Ryan's longtime friend from the force. We need to speak with you, the officer said, his voice firm. Dr. Whitman's entire body went rigid. For the first time, a crack appeared in his calm exterior. What is this? We received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity regarding a patient's medication, the officer continued. We have reason to believe there may have been tampering. Emily's breath caught. Anonymous tip. She glanced at Jake. He gave her a small nod. He had sent the message. Dr. Whitman scoffed, shaking his head. This is absurd. But even as he spoke, his hands twitched at his sides. Then you won't mind coming with us for questioning, the officer said smoothly. For a moment nobody moved. The air was thick with tension. Then suddenly Dr. Whitman turned fast. He lunged toward the door, shoving past the officer in an attempt to run. But he never got far. Max reacted instantly, leaping forward. His powerful body blocked the exit, his growl deep and threatening. Dr. Whitman skidded to a stop. The officer seized the moment, grabbing him by the arm. "You're not going anywhere." Emily watched as Dr. Whitman's face twisted in frustration. He didn't fight, but the look in his eyes was undeniable. He had been caught. As the officer began leading him out, Dr. Whitman turned his head slightly. His gaze met Emily's, cold and calculating. Then he smirked. Emily's blood ran cold. He wasn't afraid. Even as he was escorted out, he didn't look like a man who had lost. And that's when she realized. This wasn't over. Emily stood frozen, watching as Dr. Whitman was led down the hallway. His smirk lingered in her mind, sending a chill through her. Even though he had been caught, something about his reaction unsettled her. It was like he knew something they didn't. Like he still had control over something. Jake stepped beside her, his jaw tight. "You saw that, right?" She nodded slowly. He didn't look scared. He looked confident. Dr. Patel sighed, rubbing his temples. "This might just be the beginning," he admitted. If he was willing to switch Ryan's medication, there's no telling how many others he may have done this to. The officer who had escorted Dr. Whitman out returned a few minutes later. "We'll be launching a full investigation," he assured them. "We'll check his medical records, patient histories, everything. If he's been doing this for a while, we'll find proof." Emily let out a shaky breath. "And Ryan?" Dr. Patel gave a reassuring nod. "He's stable. We caught this in time. If Max hadn't noticed," he trailed off, shaking his head. "It could have been much worse." Emily kneeled down beside Max, running her fingers through his fur. He had saved Ryan's life. Again. Jake crouched beside her. "Good boy," he murmured, scratching behind Max's ears. Max wagged his tail but kept his eyes locked on the hallway, as if he were still on high alert. A few hours passed in a blur of paperwork, questioning and hushed conversations. The hospital was buzzing with murmurs about Dr. Whitman's arrest. It seemed no one had suspected him, not even his own colleagues. Emily sat by Ryan's bedside, exhaustion settling over her. He looked better now, his breathing steady, his color returning. She reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. Then, for the first time since all of this started, his fingers moved. Her breath caught. "Ryan!" His eyelids fluttered slightly. A soft groan escaped his lips. Emily's heart pounded. She leaned in closer. "Ryan, can you hear me?" Slowly, his eyes opened. It took a moment for them to focus, but when they did, they landed on her. A small, tired smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Hey," he croaked. His voice was weak, but it was him. Tears pricked Emily's eyes. She let out a small laugh of relief. "You scared us," she whispered. Jake stepped closer, his face filled with both relief and disbelief. "Welcome back, buddy." Ryan's gaze flickered between them, then landed on Max. "Did he?" His voice was hoarse, but he didn't need to finish the question. Emily nodded, wiping at her eyes. "He saved you. Again." Ryan exhaled a soft chuckle. "Good dog." Max let out a low whine, pressing his nose against Ryan's hand. Dr. Patel entered the room just in time to see Ryan awake. A relieved smile crossed his face. "Well, this is good news," he said, checking the monitors. "You're stronger than we thought, officer." Ryan blinked at him. "Dr. Patel." He looked around the room, his forehead creasing. "What happened?" Emily hesitated, not sure how much to tell him. "It's a long story," she said gently. Jake nodded. "We'll catch you up later. For now, just rest." Ryan frowned slightly but didn't argue. His eyes started to droop again, exhaustion taking over. Dr. Patel turned to Emily and Jake. "He's still weak, but he's going to be okay. He just needs time to recover." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in days she could breathe. Over the next few days, The hospital remained on high alert. The police investigation uncovered disturbing details. Dr. Whitman had been altering medications for months. Some patients had suffered complications, but no one had connected the dots until now. Emily couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to losing Ryan. If Max hadn't sensed something was wrong, if they hadn't been paying attention, it might have been too late. Jake walked up beside her one afternoon as they sat in the waiting area. Still thinking about it. She nodded. I just keep wondering why. Why would he do this? Jake sighed. Some people abuse power when they have it. Maybe he thought he could get away with it forever. Emily shook her head. It's terrifying. Someone you're supposed to trust, someone who's meant to save lives. And he was doing the opposite. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, but he didn't get away with it. And Ryan's alive because of you. Because of Max. She smiled down at Max, who was curled up at her feet. He's a hero, she whispered. A few days later, Ryan was well enough to sit up and talk. He listened intently as Emily and Jake filled him in on everything. When they finished, he shook his head in disbelief. I owe Max my life, he said. Max thumped his tail against the floor, as if he understood. Ryan reached out and ran a hand through the dog's fur. Guess I'm not done yet, he murmured. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Ryan exhaled. I was thinking, maybe it's time for a change. Jake raised an eyebrow. You mean leaving the force? Ryan shook his head. Not exactly. But after everything that's happened, I think I want to do something different. Maybe work with K9 units, train police dogs. Max saved me, and I think dogs like him could save a lot more lives. Emily felt her heart swell. That's actually perfect for you. Ryan smiled. Yeah, I think it is. As the days passed, things slowly returned to normal. Dr. Whitman's arrest made headlines, and the hospital implemented stricter policies to prevent anything like this from happening again. Ryan was discharged a week later. When he stepped outside, the first thing he did was kneel down and hug Max. You really are my guardian angel, aren't you? He murmured. Max licked his face, tail wagging furiously. Emily and Jake stood beside him, watching the moment with warm smiles. Jake clapped Ryan on the back. Glad to have you back, man. Ryan nodded, looking at his two best friends, and the dog who had saved him. I think I got a second chance, he said. And I'm not going to waste it. As they walked away from the hospital, Max trotting happily beside them, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. The nightmare was over. They had made it through. And through it all, Max had been there, watching, protecting, never leaving their side. True hero.